Let me try to do one more here. I want to talk about buying knives from different dealers and different companies. By shopping the same kind of knife at different companies and different dealers, it has opened my eyes to better understanding what I'm sharpening. You see, there's a lot of knives that look the same, but they really aren't the same. And technically, they probably shouldn't be sharpened the same. Although, you take any piece of steel, like a knife, I don't care whether it's one-sided or two-sided, and you make a keen edge on it, I don't care if it's even or the angle's different or whatever, but you make a keen edge on it on a thin piece of steel, it's going to cut. And if you make a real keen edge, it's going to cut sharp. Cut well and be sharp. But it's not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily sharpened the way the knife maker intended for it to be sharpened. And that's where I am. I'm trying to understand by looking at it and looking at the catalog and looking at the specification what this knife is that I bought, looking at it physically under magnification and seeing how one side differs from the other, and then trying to apply my wicked edge sharpening technique, those finding the sweet spot and matching the angle and making the bevel sides even, all those things that we strive for. Now I'm learning how to do it on an uneven ground knife, that the inside is more flat than the outside. And because the shape of the knife is differently, when we clamp it vertically to sharpen in a wicked edge, we're applying a edge in a symmetrical fashion to an unsymmetrical piece of steel. So in order to match the steel the way the knife maker intended for it to be made, and that was the previous video about using a knife until you understand what you're using, I try to identify the knife physically and then match the maker's grind when I sharpen it. And by looking at these 70-30 and these 90-10 and these 50-50 and looking at how the different edges were applied under magnification, that is what allows me, when I sharpen these knives, to emulate the grind the maker applied to these knives. And that matching the maker's grind is what's allowing me to understand and develop my theory about how to sharpen these knives. If you go to the catalog on these knives at the different makers, they describe uneven bevel knives, even bevel knives, one-sided knives. Some just use words, even. That suggests it's a 50-50 grind, the angle's the same on both sides. Some say uneven. That's all it says. Some say a ratio, 70-30. That means that it's an uneven grind of a 70-30 ratio, or an uneven grind of an 80-20. This is a 90-10 right-handed knife. It's almost flat on this side and a little bit of a curve on that side. But the inside bevel is described as 10 and the outside as 90. What do these numbers mean? Here's another one, for instance. Here's a Hattori Hanasaki. That's a chicken boning knife, and you can see it's got a bevel on one side a edge grind on one side with a bevel and a almost flat grind on the inside with a bevel. Those bevels are uneven. This knife, when you clamp it, the way this stone sees it and the way this stone sees it is different because this is a flatter edge than that one. Setting these angles on a wicked edge the same, symmetrical side to side, when that stone touches the knife, it will be different because the sides of the clamp knife are different. These are the things that I'm studying by buying these knives, by collecting them, by looking at them with USB microscopes, by using them until they need to be sharpened. This is the type of stuff I'm trying to learn about these knives so that I can sharpen them with an edge, with the wicked edge fixed angle sharpening system. I can adapt my clamping method, my angle setting method to best apply a sharpened bevel that matches or emulates that inspected bevel that I saw when I took this out of the box and inspected it and photographed it. Years later, when I get to sharpen it, if it takes that long, some knives I have here that I've never sharpened and they're 2-3 years old because they don't need to be sharpened yet. I used a couple knives last night to see if they need to be sharpened yet, and they're getting there. I have a pair of knives that are the same knives, again, in different steels. I try to buy the same knife in different steels in order to compare the steels, to compare how they sharpen, to compare how they cut when both are sharpened the same, to compare how long one steel lasts as compared to the other steel. Those type of questions. Plus, how to sharpen the uneven grinds properly. It's a challenge because, as I said earlier, I emulate the grind. And there is a lot of latitude because even though these are production knives, not like the shuns and the axles in big, massive quantity, but these are still production knives and they're very good quality knives, but you can see the handmade quality to it when you look at the edge grinds. So we have these two. This one is a Hanasaki. This one's called the Deba. They're both one-sided knives, so the sharpening challenge is not only to match that, but then to know how to match both sides and how to sharpen a knife simultaneously but separately. And that's what my knife collection has been about. That's what all my studying has led me to, is trying to understand how to emulate a knife maker's edge with the fixed angle sharpening of the wicked edge system. And understanding, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word. To dissect, to dissect the catalogs from the different dealers, because this same knife might be at 3 different wholesalers and each one of them has described it differently. Some call it a 70-30, some call it a 70-20, some call it an uneven grind. And the thing is that how I look at it, how I understand it, dictates to me, to my method, how I'm going to approach this to sharpen it. And then when I look at the way this knife is described, sometimes it doesn't add up. Some call it an 80-20, some call this a 70-30, some call this an 80-20 and a 70-30, even though it's the same knife. And when you look at it, the one that's called an 80-20 suggests to you that it's more like a one-sided knife than a 70-30, 70-30 ratio versus 80-20. But when I looked at them, they appeared that the opposite was true. So that told me that these numbers, these descriptions, the 80-20, 70-30, that there's some latitude in there. There's some writer's creativity, some embellishment, some trail from tradition, some understanding that doesn't follow what I have learned by reading from the old rules, the old explanations. Real quick, the 70-20, 70-30, 80-20, 90-10, 50-50, 60-40. These descriptions are a ratio of one bevel to the other bevel. Now, whether they're a ratio of how it's to be sharpened or a ratio of the description of how it's ground, as I get into it further and look, I can't find the answer to that question. What I've learned is that ratio is to suggest that 70% of your sharpening effort goes on the 70% side, and 30% of your time and effort goes on the 30% side. So the 70% has a more pronounced bevel because it got sharpened more than the 30%. But what I'm learning is the 70-30 is not a quantifiable measure. It is not countable. It is theoretical. It is a measure of your effort. But the way different people describe that same knife is different, so it becomes confusing. The best thing that I can tell you is if you want to match it, use a marker on those knives that are uneven and treat each side on a wicked edge like you're finding the angle separately, and go from there to try to see what you're working with to start with. But some of these knives in the inexpensive price point, because they are handmade, like I said, by that guy running across the belt, there are inconsistencies. And you will see in a $60, $70 knife that the quality control is not quite there. So then what we do is we try to make a judgment, and we try to match it as best we can and go from there. But the bottom line is, if you put a keen edge on these uneven bevel knives so that one side comes together keenly, that knife is going to be very sharp. I am trying to determine what that angle should be to match it, and that's one of the things that we're going to work on. And that's one of the reasons why I want to have this knife talk. This Sunday school knife talk is to show you where I went with this, where my schooling has taken me, where I'm at with my sharpening skill, my sharpening thought and theory, more than the practical. We got both things going on here. We got the practical method of sharpening, and then we got the theory, understanding what we're looking at to decide what practical method to apply. Thanks.